enjoy their home there. It's a very nice home. And it's a blessing to be here this morning. I was listening to or reading those lyrics, and it said in one of the song before this one that He is here, like He's present at this moment, at this time, in this place, and very much so, especially if it's that we're here to worship Christ, to bless His holy name. It was moving. And for today's announcements, it's going to be the one announcement, the Joy of Festival, as it's been dubbed by Terry. The Joy of Festival that's happening June 7th. So I don't think you even have to bring joy, right? The joy is going to be here already. You just come, and there'll be joy. And looking forward to it. It'll be here at this parking lot, and invite all those kids that around your family members and everybody. Invite them. I'll be doing that, and that is about it. And if you would please stand for today's reading of the Word of God, which will be Nolan.
The reading today is going to be in 1 Thessalonians. But I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning them which are asleep, that ye sorrow not, even as others which have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so them also which sleep in Jesus will God bring with him. For this we say unto you by the word of the Lord, that we which are alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord shall not prevent them which are asleep. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. Wherefore, comfort one another with these words. But of the times and of the seasons, brethren, we have no need that I write unto you. For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. For when they shall say, peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, and travail upon a woman and child, and they shall not escape. But ye, brethren, are not in darkness, that day should overtake you as a thief. Ye are the children of light, and the children of the day. Ye are not of the night, nor of darkness. Therefore let us not sleep, as do others, but let us watch and be sober. For they that sleep, sleep in the night, and they that be drunken are drunken in the night. But let us, who are of the day, be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet, the hope of salvation. For God hath not appointed us to wrath, but to obtain salvation, our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, that whether we wake or sleep, we should live together with him. Wherefore, comfort yourselves together and edify one another, even as also ye do. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, we're in 1 Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians is one of the first, is widely believed to be one of the first epistles that Paul wrote. Some scholars think it's actually the first one. I don't. I think Galatians was the first book of the New Testament written, probably, and certainly the first book of first epistle of Paul. But 1 Thessalonians is certainly a very early book in his repertoire of epistles. He writes it to a church that is in Greece, what is now known as in Greece, which is Thessalonica. It's one of the cities that he went to after he was expelled out of Philippi. As you remember when we talked about Philippians, he was in Philippi. He had come across from what's called the east, which is the eastern side of the Mediterranean, where he says that the doors of the gospel have been closed off to him. And then he got a vision to go into Macedonia, which is northern Greece, and he went across into the western side of the what's called the western part of the Empire, Roman Empire, which is the west side of the Mediterranean. He goes into Philippi, where he is very quickly apprehended, beaten, treated poorly, and eventually, pretty soon after that, is released and has to leave the city. And he goes from there, he starts, in one of the next cities he goes to is Thessalonica. And in Thessalonica, he has a tremendous open door, especially among the Gentiles of the gospel. And he establishes a very successful church in Thessalonica, but that church was subject to a lot of persecution. They received a tremendous amount of persecution. The Jews received, the Jewish believers were persecuted by the Jewish non-converts, the Jewish stalwarts in that city, and the Gentiles were also persecuted by the Gentiles of that city. And so when Paul writes to them, he's writing to them as a church that is under a lot of persecution. And so we are looking at here this epistle that he writes them. He actually writes them 2 epistles, and it looks like the second one, which we'll look at next week, was written right after the first one, pretty quickly after, because there was a number of things that the Thessalonians had misunderstood in this first epistle, especially dealing with the passage that we just read. There was a lot of misunderstanding as to what Paul was saying to them in that passage. And we'll talk more about that misunderstanding, that historical misunderstanding, next week as he tries to clarify and clean up some of those misunderstandings. But this passage has been misunderstood for a long time, by not just historically by the Thessalonians and their view of what they thought he was saying, but even to this day, this is a very popular passage among evangelicals, and I think it's a very misunderstood passage. So we're going to look a little bit at that and what those misunderstandings are. But we have to understand Thessalonians in its literary context, the way we've been trying to do in all these books of the New Testament. And what tends to happen, what we tend to do as evangelicals, is we find passages like the one that Nolan just read that talk about this very emotional aspect of Christianity, which is this coming of Christ, what many think is the rapture. They think that the rapture is talked about in this passage, and so that's very sensational and very emotional. And so we find these passages that deal with these things that are very exciting, and we focus on them. We zero in on those, and we're not looking at how those passages fit in a broader context. And I think that's a mistake, because this is just one piece of a very much larger puzzle that we're supposed to put together and look at and see the full picture. And the full picture of these epistles is quite mundane. It's not exciting. We looked at that last week. We talked a little bit about that in Colossians. But every one of the epistles, you look at them, these letters, they are dealing with everyday living. And we tend to just pull out, not look at that, tend to not focus on that, and to focus on these more sensational aspects, or either our personal salvation, anything to do with personal salvation, we look at that very closely, and that's great. And we look at these things dealing with eschatology, about whether or not how Christ is going to return, and we look at that, and these things really take up our interest, and we ought to be looking at the broader picture. And the broader picture is, Paul is telling these Thessalonians, who are real people, living in a real city, having real problems, suffering real persecution, how they should be living their lives. And that is relevant to us, even if it's not exciting. So the Christianity really had a massive impact on the world. In fact, Christianity created the world as the world you know. The idea that society would have eventually evolved into what it is today without Christianity, that is not an obvious conclusion. That is not something that's just self-evident. In fact, it is argued by many historians that that is simply not the case, because we can go to other parts in the world where Christianity is not dominant, and we don't see the supposed natural evolution of human rights, of women's rights, children's rights. These are not things that you find, for instance, in Muslim countries. And so the idea that the world was on an upward trajectory of human rights and of and of the rights of the individual and of freedom and safety and security, that's simply not an historically accurate view. Christianity is what introduced this world that you and I know and take for granted. And it did so by addressing three main categories of human interaction. We can summarize them as this. One is how we react to things. So Christianity taught us a lot about anger, vengeance, and forgiveness. That didn't exist before that. Christianity introduced an entirely new way of dealing with our reactions to each other. So if you wrong me in a shame and honor culture, if I were to forgive that, I am merely I'm allowing myself to be minimized, to be diminished, and my reputation to be lost, and I'm subjecting myself to becoming the victim of more abuse. Christianity says to turn the other cheek. Not even Jews believe that. There's a real famous, I say it's famous, probably not anymore, it was at one time, pretty well-known series of detective novels. I really like them. It's the Rabbi Small novels. If you're interested in that, you can look for them. You can get them on Kindle really cheap. But Rabbi Small, he's this fictional rabbi in this little northeastern town, and he also ends up solving a lot of crimes that happen in his little community. And I like him because most of the books deal with Judaism and his problems he has with his congregation. And as a pastor, I like to read that, to know that I'm not alone, right? So you like to group with people that. So anyway, so Rabbi Small it has all kinds of problems with his congregation. So a lot of the books deal with that. But one of the things is he deals a lot with Judaism, and the author was Jewish, Orthodox Jewish, and he writes from that perspective. And one of the things that he points out in one of the books is that the idea of turning the other cheek, that's not a Jewish concept. That's a Christian concept, and it is. The Old Testament does not preach turn the other cheek. It preaches an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And so this idea of how we react to each other, how we should control our anger, we should remit our vengeance, and we should exercise forgiveness in a radical way, that was a Christian innovation built on the teachings of Jesus. Second thing they did was their conversations, how they spoke to each other, meaning honesty, speaking always for edification, for building up, not tearing down, and everything being said in charity and love. Very much a Christian innovation. And the third thing they dealt with, so they dealt with how we react to each other, how we converse with each other, and the third thing is they dealt with sex a lot. And the reason is because the Greco-Roman Empire and the larger pagan world, they had a very rigid, a very structured view of sex. Now, we often think, and this is a common misconception, that Christianity came into the wild, wild west of the sexual world, where everything was allowed and everybody was free to do as they pleased, and that Christianity came along and started putting rules on everybody. And that Christianity is this sex-obsessed, rule-based religion. Now that is just entirely ahistorical. There's a great book on this written by a man named Kyle Harper. It's called From Shame to Sin. It's certainly not a light read. It's an academic book. But he goes to great lengths and really does a good job at exposing that idea as being entirely mythological. The Roman world was not the Wild West where everyone did and slept with whoever they wanted, however they wanted. Now, if we compare the sexual morality of the Roman world of the time of that Thessalonians is written to our world today, there are great differences. Homosexuality was very common in that world. Very common, much more common than it is today. Pederasty, what we think of as pedophilia, very common. In fact, pretty much every young boy was going to be subject to pedophilia in his lifetime. It was just considered a rite of passage. Adultery, fornication, these were all very common, but they weren't without order. There was a very, very clear, very rigid order imposed on sex. They just had a different value system. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details. We could talk about that some other time. But the point is that when Christianity came along, it wasn't that they came with a bunch of rules about sex and imposed upon a world that didn't have any rules. There were very strict, very rigid rules, very well documented. There's tons of ancient writing on these things telling people how they should conduct their sex lives. Christianity came with an entirely new fundamental value system. And it transformed the way we think of sex. So it took sex, so the way that Kyle Harper summarizes it, and in the very beginning, his introduction of his book, is that it took sex out of the city and put it into the cosmos. Meaning that for ancient people, sex was something that was tied to your reputation, to your shame and to your honor. And so who you had sex with didn't have to do with their gender. It had to do with what created shame and honor. And illicit or illegal or immoral sex was sex that diminished your honor, that created shame. Christianity came along and says, no, sex is not about what your neighbor thinks about it. It's not about your city. It's cosmological. It's about what God thinks about it. It's what He designed it for and what His purpose is in it, and that's what determines whether or not sex is moral, immoral, licit, or illicit. And because of that shift from the local opinion of your community to the transcendent cosmological opinion of the Creator God, all of a sudden, things that at one point were licit and moral in the Roman system are now illicit and immoral. So, for instance, homosexuality. In the Roman system, homosexuality was permitted so long as the submissive partner was inferior in social status. So if you are socially inferior, then you can be a passive partner in a homosexual relationship. But if you're socially superior and you're playing the passive part, then that's immorality. Christianity says no, homosexuality itself is immoral. It's wrong. So Christianity came and says, what, how, and so a lot of times we look back and they try to say, well, Paul, when he talks about homosexuality, he's really talking about whether or not who's passive or who's aggressive. He's talking about these roles that are played, and it's like, no, that's not at all what's going on. Paul is saying that works in that shame-honor value system, but it doesn't work when we transcend sex out of the local view and put it into a cosmological view, and we say sex is about what God intended and designed for it. Now, everything outside of a man-woman marriage is sin. And so that's how sex changed dramatically. How dramatically did it change? No, not just Kyle Harper, but other historians, even non-Christian historians, have observed that there has probably never been a more radical change in human behavior in all of history than the change in sexual behavior brought on by Christianity. A radical change. What you and I, even if you're here today and you're not a believer, you're not sure about all this Christian stuff, what you think of as proper, normal behavior, sexual behavior, is entirely Christian. If you don't think that people should be subjected to rape or extortion, sexual extortion, in other words, their boss hitting on them, if you think that men and women have equal rights over their own body and the body of their spouse, well, then you're Christian, because those are not pagan ideas. That is not the freewheeling love of the Greco-Roman Empire that you think you're looking at when you see their nude statues that's being depicted. That is not what's being depicted. You should read the history of what those statues are representing, and you'll find they are representing a sexual morality that is entirely alien to your worldview. Even if you're not a Christian, your worldview when it comes to sex is incredibly Christian. So Paul writes, Thessalonians, dealing with this. You can look at it just above where Nolan read. At the very beginning of chapter 4, he says this, "For this is the will of God," 4 verse 3, "even your sanctification, that ye should abstain from fornication, that every one of you should know how to possess his body in sanctification and honor, not in the lust of concupiscence, even as the Gentiles which know not God." That's how Paul begins what Nolan read. What he does is he talks about sex, and then he goes to the second coming. Now, we often think that these are not connected, but Paul is saying these are very connected. How are they connected? Paul is writing all of these churches. Practically every one of his epistles deals with sex. We haven't talked about it because there's been other more broader themes, but Thessalonians really does tie this together very tightly. So we're going to deal with it a little bit here. But in almost all the epistles, they deal with sex. And that is because of the three things. This is probably what made Christians stand out the most. You have to understand, we have to get an appreciation for what this small community church would look like that Paul is writing to. These are Thessalonians who were born and lived in that city. You and I are travelers. We travel further to church than your grandparents traveled all week long anywhere. I remember my dad telling me that when he was a kid, every now and then they would make a trip from their farm in central Michigan to Grand Rapids or Lansing, two of the big cities nearby. And they would pack a lunch and stop on the way and have a picnic lunch for a 30-minute drive. It's 30 minutes or less, because that was a long ways. You and I are traveling people. It is nothing for us to get in the car and drive 2 hours to go do something, turn around and come back that same day and think nothing of it. In the year when Paul writes this, most people are not traveling. They are born, raised, and die in their town. And they don't move very much. They know everybody, and everybody knows everybody else. And everybody is into everybody's business. Unless you are nobility or extraordinarily wealthy, there is no such thing as privacy in your life. Everything you did, everything you said was public property. There's no windows. There's very little in the way of doors on these houses. Houses are stuck together. You're sharing all your other's communal spaces are shared. You don't have your own bathroom. You go down to the public bathroom where everybody sits in a row, like you see in the old World War II pictures in the military. So when somebody starts behaving oddly, out of normal, it's immediately news. Immediately, everybody in the town knows about this. So the entire world practices sex in a certain way, under certain guidelines, certain rules of behavior. The Christian community that Paul establishes, he teaches them that's all wrong. And you're going to live your lives differently. You're going to react differently to how people treat you. You're going to speak about people differently. And you're going to have sex differently. And this was big news. And this created a great deal of conflict in a very small town like Thessalonica, where being odd has never been anybody's desire. Even today, when we have what's called expressive individualism, and people want to be like, I'm going to be my own person, and I'm going to be weird, they're only weird within an acceptable range. They're not actually weird. And so nobody ever wants to stand out. Standing out is dangerous, especially in that time. And so Paul writes this, and he tells them, you're going to be strange, you're going to be weird in many ways, including in your sex life. And now, in Paul's epistles, he bases that weirdness on two historical things, two historical events. Most of the epistles, they're based on the cross. That because of what we understand by the cross, we should live our life this way. Thessalonians is very odd in Paul's epistles because he doesn't actually speak of the cross. He doesn't mention it. He only talks about the death of Christ very briefly twice, 2 mentions in the whole epistle. He talks about some other historical event, a future historical event, and that's the second coming. He's telling the Thessalonians that they need to draw upon their belief, their faith, in this second coming, that Jesus is returning, in order that they can live their lives now in this appropriate Christian way. And this is where I think there's a misunderstanding about what Paul is saying here. Many people read this text that Nolan read and think that what they're reading is they're reading the promise of a rapture and going to heaven when they die. That's what they think they're reading. The reason they think they're reading that is because they've been told that's what they're reading. Now, I want to tell you that before the early 1800s, nobody read that passage like that. That's a very novel understanding of that passage because it doesn't actually say any of that. It only says that if you're looking for it to say that. What Paul is telling them is that they have this very difficult task at hand. A task of living a radically different life than everyone around them in a place where where that lifestyle is being persecuted by their neighbors and those who used to be their friends, and that they need to draw strength to live that daily life right by remembering that this event is going to happen. Jesus is going to come back. This second coming, what's called, many of you read the literature, called the parousia, the second coming of Christ. He's returning to earth, and that because we have that conviction, we have that promise and that hope, then that can give us strength to live a life that's out of step with our community. That's what Paul is trying to explain in 1 Thessalonians. The misunderstandings that came through, we'll talk about later, what they misunderstood and how Paul corrected those, but that's what he's trying to get across. Jesus is coming back. So what is he saying here? He's not saying that we can live our lives the way we should because we know we're going to heaven when we die. I think that's actually counterproductive to living our lives as we should. It's a Platonic view that's saying that the life you live here either A, is of no significance whatsoever, and it's just like you're just stuck inside this body and inside this world, and that the hope of all Christians is to just get free of that as soon as we can and go live somewhere else outside of this world. Or B, it's to believe that the life you live now, especially pertaining to sex, is all about purity and being deserving of heaven. And so what has happened is that Christianity, through the Middle Ages especially, took the apostolic view and teaching of sex and sin and went back to the shame paradigm, where now sex outside of marriage isn't just a failure of design. It actually contaminates you and somehow sullies you, dirties you, and makes you in some way unworthy of going to heaven, which is not what the apostles taught. The apostles were very clear that sex outside of marriage is sin. They were also very clear that there is forgiveness and there is repentance and forgiveness and sanctification in it. And that just because somebody has lived the most sordid possible life you can imagine sexually, does not mean that they can't be totally forgiven by Christ, and that past life has no power to sully them in what they are, because it's a matter of design. It's like, for the apostles, to use a modern metaphor, it'd be like this. Sex outside of marriage is like using a tool for something it wasn't designed for. So if you take, for instance, I work in construction, and things that I have to constantly get after people who work with me on is that they want to use the drills that I provide for them as hammers. And they want to bang stuff with them. Now, I think they should use their heads because obviously there's nothing in there to be damaged. It doesn't contaminate the drill to use it as a hammer, but it's not what it was designed to be used for. Sex outside of marriage doesn't dirty you. It breaks the design that God has put in you. And the solution to it is repentance and restoration. And the problem, and then what's left is not like somehow there's this horrible cloud of shame on you that somehow has to, you have to deal with your whole life. That isn't how it works at all. That's why Paul could write to some of the most sexually, quote-unquote, impure people in the Bible, which were the Corinthians, and say, you were these things. And he mentions this, the most horrible things we could imagine. He says, you were that, but you have been washed, but you have been sanctified, but you have been justified and glorified. This isn't to say that sex outside of marriage is less sinful. It's to say sin isn't impurity. Sin is brokenness. And Jesus came to fix brokenness. And so Paul says that the way that we can live our daily lives in all aspects, whether it's our sex lives, whether it's how we react to things, our anger, forgiveness, whether it's our conversation, the words we say, how we express ourselves. How do we live a life that is so out of step with the world around us? He says we have to have this second coming understood. We have to understand what the second coming is. And this is where I think what's not understood about what Paul is saying. Paul is not saying that Jesus is coming back to take everybody to heaven so they can get out of these dirty, filthy bodies. That is not what Paul is saying. What Paul is saying is that Jesus is returning, and he's using a metaphor that was very common, that the Thessalonians and everybody living in the Roman Empire would have understood this metaphor. It had been it's a very common thing to happen. So here's what would happen. A Caesar would conquer a region. And they would send what we would now think of as pioneers, or settlers, or homesteaders into the cities of that region to set up little communities of Roman values. And they would set up, and those people were not supposed to immigrate. They weren't immigrants. They weren't supposed to assimilate into the community. They weren't supposed to adopt those people's lifestyles. They were supposed to go in there and set up an outpost of Roman values and Roman virtues. And they were supposed to be living, a lot of times these would be soldiers and their families. And they were supposed to be living as Romans in a non-Roman world. Eventually, as that campaign wound down, the general or the king or whoever it was would eventually come into that city. And all that Roman citizenry, that little outpost of settlers and pioneers, homesteaders, would go out of the city to welcome that king, that Caesar, that general, back into town to take over the entire administration now of that city and turn the whole city into a Roman city. So that's what they would do. We see this even in Judaism. We see it in Jesus. Remember when Jesus comes on Palm Sunday? He comes riding on the donkey into town. All the people come out to meet him and then, as an entourage, accompany him back into the city. Because that was the honorable and correct thing to do. You didn't sit in your house and wait for the king to come visit you. You went out and met him and then escorted him back in to the city to establish his dominion over it. This is the metaphor that Paul is talking about here in 1 Thessalonians. This is what he's telling us that us as Christians are intended to do. And the consolation he's saying is, it doesn't just apply to the living. This was why the Thessalonians were distraught. They expected that return of Jesus in their lifetime. They didn't expect to go to heaven, and nobody expects to go to heaven in their lifetime. And if it was heaven that he's talking about, you're going to die and go to heaven. As that's the idea. If that's the idea, well then everybody's going to get that. You don't need to be told it's going to happen. It'll happen when you die. But he's telling them, if you've died, you haven't missed out on the second coming. This is the consolation that Thessalonians has given them. It doesn't matter if you're already dead. You will meet Christ and get to come back to your communities with him to establish his reign on earth. Their concern was that they were going to live their lives as Christian citizens completely at odds with their community, under persecution because they're such weirdos. I mean, think about it. Everyone thought they were weirdos. They talked weird. They reacted weird. Their sexual lives were weird. These are the three big things of human interaction, and these people are just freaking weird. And they're thinking, why are we living like this? Why are we under such persecution? Why are we under such trouble? Why are we putting up with this? If we're going to die and we're not going to see the second coming. It's not that they were going to die and we're not going to go to heaven. It's not that we're going to die and not be resurrected in the last day. They all knew that was true. But what they wanted is they wanted to be there when that living on earth was validated. They hadn't just lived their life in such a weird, unfruitful way. You and I are very blessed. We live that life and we are generally prosperous because of it. They were not. For them, it was very costly to live a Christian life. So why would they do that if the promise that one day their entire world would be transformed? And it wouldn't just be this small community of Christians that are weird in this way, but the whole world would become weird. If they didn't get to be part of that, then what's the point of living that way? And it's the same dilemma, I think, that many of us today have as Christians. Our dilemma is, why are we bothering trying to live our life? Why don't we just wait and go to heaven, and God will just make everything right there? What's the point of all this trouble, of being weird now? What's the point of controlling yourself and being chaste and being self-disciplined and controlling your mouth and controlling your anger? What's the point of that if the world is just going to hell in a handbasket? Paul is telling them, no, Jesus is going to return. We do not know when. It may be, he says, it may be in your lifetime, it may not be in your lifetime. Even Jesus himself said, no one knows the day or the hour. Not even the Son knows the day or the hour. Only the Father, it's reserved in his hand. We don't know when he's returning. But Paul says he is returning. And when he returns, he's going to return with everyone who was his people. All those who had through faith become the people of God are returning with him to establish that kingdom on earth where heaven is going to absorb earth. And two, that second coming is going to totally transform the world. That the small transformation that we see in our own selves is going to be writ large across all of creation. Not just human creation or earthly creation, but all of creation is going to be transformed, fundamentally transformed in the very most perfect way that you find in yourself. So when you see within yourself the transformation that Jesus puts in your life, the very perfect essence of it, deep down, that part that you know is without any contamination, that is going to be magnified through all of creation. Jesus is coming back as the king with a new kingdom. He's going to establish a new world order, and he's going to transform everything. And the world is not going to be odd anymore to you. You aren't going to be weird anymore. The world's going to be what Christianity has been saying it should be all the time. Because Paul says at the end of the passage, he says, because we're not darkness, we're light. What he's saying is, we're not the ones who are wrong. This is not about Jesus has a worldview and Caesar has a competing worldview. He's saying they don't have a worldview. They don't have an opinion that matters. Only Jesus has an opinion that matters. That he made the world, he designed it in a certain way. The reason why the sexual teaching of the church works and the sexual teaching of the world does not is because that of the church is aligned with the design of God. It's why a hammer works to bang on nails and a glass vase does not. That is not a matter of opinion. That is what Paul is saying. Paul is saying that this transformation that is going to happen in the world, that Jesus is bringing back with him in his second coming, this is not a matter of opinion. He is going to set everything right. He's going to reestablish things based on their original fundamental design, and they're going to work the way they're supposed to work. And so knowing that, we as Christians should live those values now, even if they're totally out of sync with our community. Even if everyone around us thinks we're crazy. Even if it costs us dearly to do so. You and I probably don't ever have that privilege. But many Christians have. Many Christians have lived lives that have cost them even their very lives. And they could do that because they understood that that life they were living was instantiating a small outpost of heavenly value right now. And that one day Jesus would return, they would return with him, and that he was going to transform the whole world to be made in the image of that lifestyle. So when he's talking there in Thessalonians, he's telling them that they need to live like citizens of heaven. Not live to go to heaven, but live as citizens of heaven here and now, with the values and the truth, the doctrines of heaven in their lives, working out of their lives, through their lives, into their neighbors, into their friends, into their co-workers. That's what he's telling them in Thessalonians. And he's telling them not to worry if they die in that project. Not to think that somehow they're going to get the short end of the stick on it. That they would have lived all that, done all that work, went to all that self-discipline, and then they died, and they didn't get to be part of that glorious, triumphant return. They don't get to see the world actually become what they had lived their whole life for it to be. He's telling them everybody who is part of the people of God are going to be resurrected. If they're alive, they're going to be caught up. They're going to meet Christ and return with him for Christ to establish his kingdom. So that's what Thessalonians is dealing with. Let's close with prayer, and then the musicians will come up and lead us through a final song. Father in heaven, we thank you for your blessed word. We thank you that it speaks to our hearts and our minds. We ask that we would listen to it, that we would seek you. Father, I ask that you would give us strength. We are very weak and frail. It is very difficult for us to live out of step with those around us. We want very much to fit in, to be accepted. And yet, Father, we now know that the glory that is of men is of no value, that only the glory that comes from you has lasting value. Father, I ask that you'd give us the faith and strength to seek the glory that only comes from you. I ask these things in the name of Jesus.
Do you all want to stand up with me?